other comments on this. So if I kind of want to I'll touch on the gender wage gap again in just a second. I think that one of the variables that needs to be acknowledged in understanding why the gender wage gap exists is absolutely, I think there's wrongful discrimination. I think that there are certain jobs that tend to be preferred by women that are underpaid, they're undervalued, and therefore women are going to get paid less. The other aspect of it is there is a genuine sex difference. Again, if we talk about average differences between people, we have this difference in men's and women's willingness to ruffle feathers within a social situation. Men are much more willing to take risks first off, in general, men tend to be greater risk takers, but especially within social situations, men may care a lot less about what other people may think of them. Versus women, again, on average, tend to have a very good sensitivity to what other people are thinking at any given time. And I think part of that is women do tend to actually be better at reading those kinds of emotions and those kinds of opinions in other people. And so I think when it comes to something like asking for a raise, men are going to be more likely to ask for a raise because they may not, read so much into it, the different social cues of like, oh, have I been fitting into the team well? Do I really deserve this? Is what's my boss going to think of me if I ask for a raise and then they don't think that I deserve it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that what you see is that men are typically willing to take those risks and ask for things, whereas women may not. And I know that there have been some programs that are specifically dedicated to essentially training both men and women, but especially with a focus on women, to ask for a raise, to ask for the kinds of things that men would just normally intuitively go after, maybe have a less problem going after. And that's certainly not women's fault, right? It's just that this is a sex difference that I think is worth acknowledging. If men and women differ in their willingness to take a risk, then that is going to translate into this potential problem for women where they're not asking for the kind of pay that they deserve. So I think that's one of the strengths of recognizing sex differences. You can recognize when those problems arise and you can try to correct them. Another part of this is, I think, that if you look at so part of the reason that the gender wage is going to exist, and I think that unfortunately, unless we start paying HR, the heads of HR as much as we pay like CEOs and stuff like that, I think one of the things that we're going to see is men and women will self-select into certain jobs. Men and women have different preferences. This is probably one of the most robust sex differences. There are some really big ones like the rate of homicide and willingness to physically aggress against another person. But one that really ranks up there is willingness to, ranks up there are preferences, are the kinds of activities that a man or a woman may typically want to engage in. And so what you tend to see is that men are going to usually gravitate towards these kinds of jobs that, first off, require a lot of system-oriented thinking. So that is fitting parts together, thinking about how, so for example, working on a car, working on engines is a very system-oriented activity where you want to understand how each of the different parts of an engine fit together to work. The same with chemistry. Chemistry is figuring out how microscopic and macroscopic molecules fit together to create new things. And so these jobs tend to pay more because these are technology related skills. These are skills that when you look at certain businesses and how businesses actually make their livelihood, they're looking for skilled workers who can, say, make new compounds, who can innovate on these physical objects that people want to buy, versus people are not really paying for human resources. They may not be paying for social work. They may not be paying for the nurses that take care of them. I think one of the unfortunate side effects is that the jobs that men tend to do tend to actually create more money in some ways. And so men are, I think, as a byproduct, going to get paid more because they, at least by private companies, tend to be valued more. Their positions create more for the company. And so men in that way kind of have more bargaining power. So this is another problem, I think, is that, again, men and women are self-selecting based on their own interests, based on their own preferences into certain types of jobs. And the things that men tend to self-select into tend to pay more. Any reactions to this? Any reactions to what I've just said, or anything related to the gender wage gap? Because I think this is a really important topic to talk about, to understand.
Why is there a gender wage gap in the medical field then? Like, if women and men are in there too.
So I'm actually unfamiliar with the ratio of men to women in so you talk about at the level of being an actual medical doctor, or at what level are you talking?
Like an actual doctor.
Actual doctor. Do we tend to see, is the ratio such that there tends to be 50% men, 50% women? Because I know at least it used to be that men were predominantly doctors, and I know that has changed a lot.
I think there's more women in the medical field now, but I believe there's still a wage gap between men are getting paid more than women.
Is it less than in other places, or is the wage gap just as large within the medical field?
It's probably like, what do you mean? Is it just as large?
So I wonder, so I know that the wage gap is something like 36 cents or something like that. What is it, 74 cents to $1, something like that. Is that gap smaller within the medical community, with among doctors? I know that on average that tends to be the wage gap across all different professions, but I wonder if it's smaller within the medical community.
It says that female specialists are earning 25 to 36% less than their male counterparts.
That's comparable, isn't it? That's about the same. Yeah, interesting. I would get, so I guess I'm not too familiar I'm not too familiar specifically with the medical field to really answer that confidently. I know that, so when I rattle off these different reasons that the gender wage gap can exist, I imagine each of the different reasons will contribute, and they'll each contribute in a different amount depending on which field you're talking about. So it might be that women are not being paid as much for, truly wrongfully discriminatory reasons. If women are getting in there, they are self-selecting into the medical field, and they're still making less. I would say there's something wrong with the system then. There's something wrong with maybe differences in how people receive raises. Or maybe it's a difference in where women get hired. This could be a possibility too. You might see men, maybe if you examine the entire medical field, again, I have no evidence to support this, so you'd have to check into this, but if men and women, men might be hired more in the kind of high prestige, high power doctor position, so in like really good hospitals, whereas maybe you do see more women, but they're being hired in those hospitals that are maybe in more rural communities, or they're being hired in areas where you're just not going to be paid as much. So there might still be a kind of a difference in social status, right? Where men are receiving kind of the high value jobs versus women are not so much. That might explain it, but again, I'm not sure. Not sure. Hmm. All right, other questions, other burning questions that you want to toss out there? Everyone else is so quiet. I have some questions that I want to throw out. We can get some stimulation here. Do you think it's even important? So I had one question from a student, and this maybe we can kind of wrap it up and everything, but I had one student in my other class ask, why is science so sexist? I mean, is it, and it's a really good question, is we're talking so much about sex differences, but should we even be acknowledging them in the first place? Why even study differences between men and women? Is that an important question?
So, what are you asking? Why we study the differences? Well, it's because men and women act different. Like, our brains are different than, like, my brain is different than yours, so we think different. So we have to study them.
Yeah, why though? I mean, there are some people who would argue that sex differences, I've seen the argument that sex differences are really the consequence of our culture, right? That it is how we are socialized. It's the way that we're brought up, the expectations that are placed upon us by our family, by our friends, etc. And if that's true, then to acknowledge sex differences is the equivalent of perpetuating them. The more you talk about them, the more you acknowledge them, the more likely they are to be passed on through this kind of this intergenerational transmission of culture. So I guess this kind of gets to the question of, do you think that these sex differences are more so generated by culture and how we are brought up, versus do you think that these sex differences are something that naturally arises from sexual development, from these more biological aspects of what makes men and women different? Would anyone venture a guess as to maybe which, do you have a strong opinion about which contributes more, biology or cultural influences, our environment? Anyone have a strong intuition about that? Or maybe it's a little bit of both, but is it more one than the other? More biology versus culture?
I think it's more culture because, like, I'm taught to do this and act a certain way, and boys are taught to do this and act a certain way from a young age, and it keeps going and passes on generation to generation.
Does everyone agree with that? Lauren, Margaret, Ainsley?
Yeah, I think that like culture and your environment um can affect it more than biology, but like I don't really know why. I mean, I guess because like like people that you're around, and I don't know, but I would say that culture does affect it more, I think.
it's very easy to observe the cultural differences. I mean, you see them. I think men and women are treated differently, and it's hard not to see that when, if women are, I mean, if parents have a child, the parents will prepare for that child in really two different ways. They'll say, "Oh, we found out it's a boy. Now we're gonna paint the room blue. We're gonna, buy race cars rather than dolls, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So we do clearly see that men and women are treated differently. The question remains: how influential is that? So if we treat men and women differently, is treating them that way actually causing this gender divide? Are we actually pushing men and women further apart than we are by treating them this way? Are we shaping men's and women's minds by through our culture? I feel like the intuition is there that that's true, but I personally am not as confident. I don't know if I would answer. I don't think that biology is more influential than culture, but I am not convinced that culture is more influential than biology. And I think it's going to depend on which trait we're talking about. Let's talk about sexual orientation for a second. Sexual orientation is something that is sex differentiated. Men tend to be attracted to women. Women tend to be attracted to men on average. Of course, there's all that in there. If you look at the contribution of kind of biological aspects of development versus cultural and environmental aspects of development, you tend to see almost kind of an even split, where people are to a great extent born that way. But then there are also certain elements of a person's culture and an environment that then also shape sexual orientation. So it's if you look at something like preferences for certain types of jobs, this turns out, so I kind of want to make a note just in case you're wondering how we differentiate how much is due to biology versus culture. They use this really interesting experimental design called a twin study. Has anyone ever heard of a twin study before? Do you know how these work? Anyone heard of a twin study? These are designs where they actually gather identical twins. So identical twins are those that share 100% of their DNA. That is, in the womb, in the uterus, what you see is that developing zygote, that cluster of balls, at some point as it's traveling to the uterus, usually near the beginning, it'll split into either two cells or two clumps of cells. So what you're doing is you're getting the exact same copy of DNA. It's just now they're actually separate as opposed to one individual. So identical twins are 100% genetically related, which means that any differences that we observe between identical twins has to be due to environment. If there are any differences between them, it must be due to environment. And so they use these really clever designs where you can actually parse out, you can kind of dull out how much of the differences between two individuals are due to their shared genes versus how much is due to their shared family environment. That is, did they grow up together? And then also their peers, who they hung out with. What happened as they grew up and they left their family home? How much is due to that kind of environment? So if you look at things like preference, that is just this kind of this feeling of, oh, I'm really interested in this, I want to do these kinds of things, that actually tends to be more controlled by biology, where you tend to see that there's a strong genetic component to wanting to do certain things, to finding certain things interesting. So there is a biological component, there is a cultural component, and depending on which aspect of psychology you're asking about, some are going to be more influential than others. Okay, so then back to our question, why acknowledge that these sex differences exist? I think that this is, I think that because if these sex differences exist for reasons other than culture, then it helps to identify how things are. If we know how things are for a given person or for groups of people, then we can design cultural interventions. We can actually design, say, educational programs that help to, say, encourage people to, so if we know that women on average are not going to be pushed towards entering the engineering profession, then perhaps we can design some kind of, we can change the educational system such that, given that we know that women may not be naturally interested in those kinds of jobs, can we push them into those jobs for different reasons? Because the reality is, if you create greater diversity within a particular company or within a particular job market, things turn out better often. You get different perspectives because men and women will view the world differently. You're going to want women in traditionally male jobs because you're going to have a different perspective. You're going to have a different outlook on how to do that job. Women may have different solutions to problems that men would not normally think of. So if we acknowledge that the difference is there, we can actually do something about it. Versus if we don't even identify it in the first place, if we don't even see that the sex difference exists, you're not going to be able to do anything. You're not going to do anything to change it, right? You may not have a very good idea of how to change it. I don't know. These are my views, but I'm not sure if anyone feels strongly one way or another. I've actually had people tell me. I mean, part of the research that I do is just by virtue of looking at evolution, natural selection, and then you talk about sexual selection, whereby men and women differ because of the way that they're valued by the opposite sex. I end up talking about sex differences a lot, and I've had people tell me, I think your work, the research that you do, is actually harmful. So this is not a niche opinion. I've actually had people tell me, I don't think your work. I think your work is actually doing harm to society, and that's really heavy to be told. Hey, I think this is bad. So this is an argument we will encounter, I think, in your life at some point. Is, should we even acknowledge that men and women are different? So we're all on the same page there. Is that what I'm picking up? That it's good to acknowledge these differences?
I think it's good because it's better to be more educated than not knowing something.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree with that.
I agree too.
Hey, Margaret. Are there any sex differences that you saw in lecture or in the Archer article that surprised you? Differences between men and women that you maybe hadn't thought of before, that you're kind of looking at and going, really, is that a difference? Anything that surprised you? Or the second question here, are there sex differences that you have noticed that you think exist but have not been mentioned? Either I didn't mention it in lecture. Oops, sorry, there's some noise outside. Anything that you thought of but I didn't mention in lecture, and they didn't mention it in the Archer article, are there either?
I have a weird question. But okay, so why is it more likely for a male to be a serial killer than a female?
That's interesting. First off, is that true that men are more likely to be serial killers? I believe that. So there's some kind of it's kind of, this topic's weird because what you see is that there are female serial killers. It's just that men and women serial killers actually tend to go about it in different ways. And so I wonder whether there tend to be relatively equal amounts, but women are less likely to get caught because they tend to use these very clandestine, very secretive, very indirect ways of murdering people. For example, men are more likely to actually stab or physically kill someone, whereas women are more likely to do things like poison people. There's no direct confrontation. So I actually don't know whether that's actually true, whether that difference actually exists, or whether it's a difference in reporting or a difference in police catching people.
Like, because I don't know, I'll just be watching Criminal Minds, and most of the males are white, and they have like a psychological issue. They're crazy. So I wondered if that had to deal with their gender, the way the males think compared to a female.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I know about psychopathy and sociopathy. There are really two types. Psychopathy is kind of a more inborn, genetically controlled type of insensitivity to other people and what their desires are and what their, whether you feel guilt towards them. So it's more of a psychopath might be someone who most people have a part of their brain that when they do something wrong, when they hurt other people, they feel guilt. What you tend to see is within psychopathy is people as they do things that harm other people, they tend not to have as strong of a guilt response. Either it's not as strong or it's completely absent. In the really extreme cases, that inhibitory sense of, oh my God, why I can't possibly do this. I couldn't possibly murder this person, or think of their family would be sad. Those thought processes just don't float to the top. And sociopathy is more of if you have an extremely violent or harsh or competitive childhood, then maybe you were not set up to kind of a insensitivity to other people's feelings or caring about them. But maybe from early on, you learned that you have to look out for yourself. The world's competitive. It's harsh. You need to shut down that kind of that feeling of guilt. So that's more sociopathy. What you tend to see is it's actually, so psychopathy as a trait. So if we conceptualize psychopathy as a trait, and that trait is determined by how much guilt you feel doing shitty things to other people, that is actually much more frequent in the population than you would see if you were just looking at serial killers. The number of serial killers in the population hovers like below 1%. But the people who actually possess traits of psychopathy tend to be much higher. It tends to actually be a normal trait. I mean, in any given situation, you're going to meet people who maybe they're not willing to kill other people, but they're willing to do things to them that they're willing to do things to other people that harm them, as long as that then benefits them in return. So that is, you're willing to do shitty things to other people if you benefit from it. That's much more common. There are a lot of people who are willing to do that. Now, the weird difference where you tend to see, you're right, it tends to be men, and it tends to be white men in particular, that tend to be at least caught, the serial killers who are caught, who we notice. I'm not sure why ethnicity would factor into that. I'm not sure. I could look into that, though, because that's a very interesting question. In terms of men, though, one of the reasons you might tend to see men being caught more, or they're known for is if they're using these kind of physically violent means of murdering other people. I mean, more evidence tends to be left behind when you actually like stab someone, versus poisoning can be done more clandestinely. The other is that men are, I don't know if this is a cultural reason, this is more influenced by culture than it is by biology, but men don't, I mean, men tend to compete with one another more than, or at least physically compete with each other more than women do. And so I'm taking a shot in the dark here a little bit, but it's possible that by virtue of men having to kind of, they don't express, they're already encouraged not to express much emotion. And I think many men already do not wish to kind of reveal the emotions that they do experience, especially around other men. It's possible that there are some aspects of psychopathy that have traditionally helped men more than those traits have helped women. So it's possible that men actually have a higher proportion of that normal type of psychopathy, of that everyday variation of psychopathy, not necessarily serial killer psychopathy, but just that willingness to do things to other people if it benefits them. I can say that with confidence, that men do tend to score higher on inventories that measure that kind of normal type of psychopathy. And so what you might see is men are carrying those traits, the genes for those traits, more often than women, then more often you're going to see kind of a high concentration of those traits in men. And when you have a high concentration of those traits, that's when you might get the really extreme cases of psychopathy, of willingness to kill other people. So yes, men do tend to score higher on traits of psychopathy, just the everyday variant. But why we tend to see more serial killers in particular, I'm not sure. My guess is you just tend to see a higher, because men are already more likely to have those traits. It's really just a step away for them to be kind of an extreme type of psychopathy. That's my informed guess. Yeah. As far as ethnicity, that's a very interesting one. I'm really not sure. It could be, this might, in terms of the difference between white versus, the reason that white men may be more likely to be serial killers is if white men are already typically higher social status, they are afforded more opportunities. They in many ways have more privilege than men and women of other ethnicities. Then it could be that something about having resources or having the opportunity, maybe even being in a position of power, tends to make it seem like you're fitting into society, and like you may go unnoticed when you are doing something that would be suspicious. So it could be that these are just the men who happen to get away with killing a lot of people before they get caught. You know what I'm saying? There's something about their position within society that is tied to their ethnicity that allows them to get away with what they're doing. Versus someone of a different ethnicity may actually still have those psychopathic traits, but because I think society is just so unfairly, I think, vigilant of non-white ethnicities, I think that people are more suspicious. People might even call in and kind of report something suspicious more often, and so the people who are non-white psychopaths might actually just get caught earlier. I don't know, but that's my guess. It likely has to do with kind of power within society, position within society. the opportunities that you have. Good question. Other questions related to sex differences or gender differences?
Why are men more risk-seeking than women are?
Sorry, more what?
Like risk-seeking?
Oh, risk-seeking.
Mhm.
So, yeah, men are riskier. Why? Does anyone want to take a guess at that? Why men tend to be greater risk takers?
Does it have something to do with like competition between males, like you were talking about? Like maybe they like want to outdo each other, or
How would it? So why? So we know that both men and women compete with one another, right? But why would men compete with each other in kind of a riskier way? Or why might they be allowed to do that? Or, I mean, there are two possibilities here, right? Is either that men are extreme risk takers, or rather that women are extremely risk averse. Now, it happens to be a little bit of both. We have to acknowledge that it's not that everyone is just kind of like starting at baseline, and so men are just this much more risky. It's also that if you look at kind of the baseline of where everyone starts, women tend to be more averse to taking risks. They're less likely to do it than say, the general, just generally would the amount of risk that people would take. So there are two questions here: either that men are greater risk takers, or why are men greater risk takers, and why are women less of risk takers? So in terms of why men are greater risk takers, I do think that there is a competitive element. I think that if men take risks, especially if they take risks in front of women, which is where you tend to see men are most willing to take risks, it can be very, very impressive. If you're in front of a group, so if you're at a party or something, or you're with a group of friends, and there are several men and then there are several women, almost every single time, at some point, a contest is going to break out, where the men start competing with each other in some way in front of an audience, in front of potential mates. I think that there is a great reward to be had if a man is willing to do something really risky and then he pulls it off, right? So if you're the guy who's willing to actually go, say, bungee jumping, or you're the guy who's willing to jump out of a plane and do some parachuting, stuff like that, or you are able and willing to do parkour. Parkour is kind of risky, right? You are actually physically scaling different buildings. You could fall, you could break a bone. When you do something that is risky and then you pull it off, what that means is you have the physical ability, you have maybe even the mental clarity, the intelligence to be able to pull off that really risky thing. So if you're looking for a potential mate, you may actually want someone who is capable of taking a risk and then pulling it off, being successful in taking risk. So I think that part of the explanation is, yes, men are trying to show off. The other thing is, though, that I think that men have in some ways less to lose from taking a risk. I think it's important to think about this in terms of what was women's situation for most of human history. Now, in modern society, women have a lot of choices available to them. You can get an education. Even being able to learn to read and write. That used to be a male-dominated thing. Women can do that now. Women can, if they especially within the United States and European countries, westernized societies, if you go through the rigors of school and you apply yourself, you have these opportunities to do what you want. That was not always the case. In many societies, and this exists for some societies that are not industrialized, women were pregnant a lot of their life. As soon as a woman was capable of having children, depending on the society and kind of how the traditions of spacing births was, women could very well be pregnant, say, 9 months out of every year. I mean, when you give birth, there is a recovery period where it's going to be very difficult to get pregnant again. The menstrual cycle has to kind of reestablish itself after you give birth. Physically, the vagina has gone through a great trauma, and so a couple of months usually a month at minimum usually have to pass before that kind of thing can reestablish itself. So 9 months go by. A month or two later, you might get pregnant again and then have a child, and then you get pregnant again and have a child. So what happened is, one possible explanation for this is, if women were pregnant for much of their adult life, for most of human history, then it would have been extremely detrimental for women to be willing to take risks. Because it's not at that point just the woman's body that she's risking. She's risking her child's life. If a woman starts doing parkour, if a woman starts doing these really physically risky behaviors, she may damage the child that she may or may not realize that she has. So I think that's another part of it, is not just that men are more willing to take risks, but women are less willing to take risks in the general population, possibly protectively, to avoid potentially damaging a child. Does that kind of answer your question of how we tend to see this sex difference?
Yes, sir. I get it. I get that.
Yeah. Does anyone have a different explanation? That's I find that to be a very evolutionarily informed reason, but I don't know. Can we think of cultural variables here as well? Cultural reasons why men and women may differ in risk taking? Do women tend to be encouraged not to take risks? I think that's changed to some degree in recent years, maybe historically. What do you think?
What risk are we talking about? Like, what risk is the person taking?
That's a good qualifier. That's a good question. So I'm sure it depends, right? Are there certain things that women tend to be discouraged from doing? Are there certain risks that women tend to be discouraged from taking? I guess is a better question. What kinds of risks do parents tend to say, hey, just avoid that, women? And there might be a sex difference where they say, okay, boys, you do this, but women, no, don't do that.
Going out, like, as a teenager, I noticed that my male friends are able to go to parties and all this stuff, but I had to stay at home. But my parents really didn't care, but I'm just saying it's to the other people.
Right. Why? Why do you think that's?
Because the parents are more protective over the girl than there is over the male, because they think a male can protect themselves.
Okay. From what? Is it physical fights? Is it being? If you look at the rate at which men and women tend to be approached, say if a man or a woman is just walking down the sidewalk, the likelihood of a woman being attacked is much greater than a man. So sure, maybe just being out alone. Is that true even so if you go out with your friends, right? I mean, that doesn't solve anything. If a parent's like, no, I don't want you to go out to this party, being with your friends is not gonna solve their reluctance to let you go, right? Why discourage women from going out and socializing and kind of being part of their social group? Seems like a huge detriment. I imagine what's going on. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you can keep going.
I was going to say, I think one big part of it is preventing pregnancy, right? Is that there is again, one of the most fundamental differences between men and women is women can get pregnant. And women have to, once they get pregnant, I mean, we have ways of preventing pregnancy and we have ways of inducing abortion, but I mean, For the most part, women are dedicated to 9 months of their lives being really different in a lot of ways versus men, not so much. So it's like if you let men go out and just be risky, do dumb stuff, yeah, they might get hurt, might physically get hurt. They're not really stuck with anything for longer than it takes to heal. I think a lot of parents are very, very cautious to not let their daughters get pregnant, essentially. I think that ties into it a lot. Okay, I actually really want to talk about the Falk article with the time that we have left. Does anyone want to summarize what the findings of this article were? So the Archer article was the very comprehensive, very long review of sex differences. Falk was the other one. What was the main finding in this article? Anyone want to summarize that? I think that this is okay. So they were looking at sex differences in various types of traits: altruism, trust, reciprocity, risk-taking, patience, preference for certain things. And they were examining this across an international sample. Let's see, this is 76 representative country samples. And if you go across the world, different countries have been more successful at achieving gender egalitarianism. That is, do men and women have equal opportunity to pursue the jobs, the hobbies, the whatever they wish to pursue? So do men and women have that equal opportunity? So you can look at kind of how sex differences manifest, what sex differences you actually see within different countries with different amounts of gender egalitarianism. And the cultural argument for sex differences goes something like this: men and women are going to differ to the extent that culture or society pushes them to behave differently. So that is, if a society has very strict gender norms, then that is going to funnel men into the masculine role, women into the feminine role, and so you're going to see differences between men and women because of how they've been funneled into those different roles. So the argument should be then that the opposite of that, the corollary of that is, well, in societies where men and women are more equal, where they have equal opportunity, you should see that there are fewer sex differences, that men and women are more similar. But what do they find? Their data support that? What did they find in this article? What was the conclusion of this article? After examining these sex differences in these many different countries with different amounts of gender egalitarianism. No one remembers. I actually found the opposite of what you would typically expect. So that is in countries where men and women had greater equal access to material and social resources, that is the opportunities that men and women may seek, when there was greater gender egalitarianism, they actually saw larger sex differences. So in societies where men and women are in many ways more equal, you actually saw that men and women behaved differently. They had different preferences. They had different amounts of patience, trust, the various traits that they measured here. Can you begin to make sense of that? Why would we see greater sex differences in countries where men and women are more equal? Does that make sense to anybody?
Is it because that they have the cultural influences, the gender roles, like they have certain jobs they work at, but at poorer countries everybody does the same thing because they're all poor and they're trying to work for what they need?
Well, in poorer countries, you still tend to see these fairly strict gender roles where the men will work and then women may not even work at all. Or if they do work, what their work typically entails is maybe taking care of a home or being a maid or doing still this sex differentiated work. So even in poorer countries, you tend to see a differentiate, a divide in what they're doing. In really extreme examples, if I'm trying to think of an example of what you're suggesting, whether that's true in certain situations. I think what you may be imagining is within the United States or within a kind of a gender egalitarian society already. If you live in a really poor community, the women may have to work, whereas they can't stay home, right? So women will have to work, and if they have to work, then they may also get a job that men are getting. But that's less to do with a difference between these gender egalitarian societies and more of a difference of, do you live in a relatively poor community where you can't just stay home and take care of the kids, where you have to go out and find a job, otherwise things go south. So that doesn't quite explain this. It doesn't quite explain this. Any other guesses as to why in gender egalitarian societies you would see greater sex differences? One of the explanations that I find convincing, I'll say, this is not the only article on this particular finding. This has been replicated again and again and again. Within the past, I want to say at this point, probably about 10 years. The first article on this came out near the beginning of the 2010s. Since then, it's been replicated. So this is not just an artifact. This is not just some random finding that got published. It's again and again. One of the explanations that I've seen that I think is convincing is that in gender egalitarian societies versus kind of more traditional societies, what you tend to see is if men and women are allowed to do whatever they want, which is what you'll see in an egalitarian society, then they will have more opportunity to self-select into the things that you would typically see men and women want to do. So men will have the leeway, the freedom to kind of get into these jobs that are traditionally more masculine, that are male typical, that are system oriented, and you'll see women are allowed to get into these kinds of jobs. They're able to get into these kinds of jobs that maybe women would typically be able to enter. Whereas in these stricter societies, women may not be allowed to do the things that they would naturally want to do. So for example, let me think of a good, we're talking about jobs, but this goes beyond jobs. This goes beyond where you're hired. This is, so for example, women compared to men will wish to, they wish to be involved in kind of organizing political campaigns and stuff like that. So that is kind of getting involved in a community, being involved in actually being out in a community and contributing to that community, contributing to a church, contributing to a community organization. In some countries, what might happen is women may not be allowed out of the household without the escort of a man. And so it could be that a woman wants to get out and actually do these kind of community-oriented things. Because they are restricted from doing so, what you see is women won't do those things. So if you look at the sex difference in willingness to go out and invest in one's community, in a restricted society, you won't see a sex difference because women are not going out because they're not allowed to go out. Versus in a society where women are allowed to go where they want and they are protected from the risks of being out in public, then you'll see this greater sex difference where more women are out doing these community projects. So you do see that sex difference. So the basic idea here is, if in an egalitarian society, men and women will be allowed to do what they want. And so if left to their own devices, they will gravitate towards these sex differentiated things, these things that you typically see men and women tend to do. Whereas in restricted societies, in some cases, women are not allowed to do much of anything. And so you're just not going to see a difference between men and women because they're restricted from doing what they want. I think this is really strong evidence for this argument that it's not just culture that shapes sex differences, gender differences. There is an innate component where men and women will differ to some degree in what their innate preferences are, what kinds of things they prefer to do. And so if you leave them to their own devices, if you create more opportunities, you should actually expect to see greater differences between men and women. I think this has consequences for things like the gender wage gap as well. Is if you free up, you create more equality, you might actually see that difference increase, funnily enough, as men and women kind of gravitate towards different paying jobs. All right, I realize we're at the end here. I don't want to leave you, keep you longer than you need to. So in the next week, we're going to be going over transgender identity. We'll be talking about what occurs when you kind of have a combination of male and female typical qualities, and when your natal sex, your sex assigned at birth, differs from how you identify or how you express yourself. I'm looking forward to that. I will also be giving some lecture material at the end of the next discussion, so you guys have been pretty good about being here, but be sure to stick around, all right? All right, have a good one, and thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.